Welcome to Agile Coaches Corner by Agile Thought, the podcast for practitioners and leaders seeking advice to refine the way they work and pave the path to better outcomes. Now, here's your host, coach, and Agile expert, Dan Neumann.
Welcome to this episode of the Agile Coaches Corner podcast. I'm your host, Dan Neumann, and excited to have you here with me yet again this week. It's exciting to think of what topics people might be interested in and then try to meet those needs with a weekly podcast episode. Again, thank you very much for being a listener here for so many years. There's lots of content we've touched on, and each week we try to bring you a different perspective and not just retread topics we've done in the past. This week's topic is about maximizing team autonomy while maintaining accountability within Agile frameworks. It can definitely be a challenge whether you're a Scrum Master, an Agile coach, or just a functional manager without one of those specific accountabilities in an organization trying to deliver value for your customers, for your users, and using an Agile framework. Agility talks about having self-managing teams or potentially autonomous teams. And yet at the same time, we can't have teams that are just running around doing whatever they want if it's misaligned with objectives and outcomes that the organization needs to achieve and is investing in for their competitive advantage and to deliver value. So let's dive in a little bit. We'll have some specific tips for you to consider as we go through this time. First of all, maybe thinking a little bit about what does autonomy look like in Agile teams. We talk about teams being self-managing. That, to me, sounds a lot like making sure that when it comes down to who's doing what, the tasks, which work items are picked up, how we collaborate, which meetings we have, which tools we use, those are some of the facets that, to me, would represent a self-managing team. Those team members need to be able to make decisions at an appropriate level. Now, for different organizations and teams, what decisions get made and at what appropriate level, that's going to vary. We'll talk a little bit about that. But they can't have this game of Mother May I, where they go and say, gosh, Mother, may I, have a cookie today? Gosh, Mother, may I go outside to play? No, these teams need to be able to make decisions within their context. That's going to enable speed. Of course, speed without control is just straight up dangerous. So we do also want to talk about having an appropriate level of control, and we'll get to that. And then these teams need to be able to drive towards solutions for the problem. Daniel Pink talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose as three keys to motivation in knowledge work. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about helping create solutions. That's part of that autonomy that Daniel Pink is talking about. Give them the outcome and let them try to achieve that. You'll hear this sentiment in the Agile Manifesto, which, my goodness, was formed in 2001 at this point. So that's 20-some years, 23 years at the time of this recording. But they talked about building projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and the support they need, and trust them to get the job done. But these people who formed the Agile Manifesto were not laissez-faire leader types who were like, yeah, we're just going to put motivated people together and we'll trust them. There was a lot of rigor around the techniques that were being used, even though it was being done in an agile way with a high trust environment and support. We also need teams to have the autonomy to welcome changing requirements, even late in development, and that agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. So as we talk about autonomous teams, yes, we want them to respond to change, and at the same time, they can't respond to change so much that it impedes the flow of value and actual delivery of increments if you're using the Scrum framework. I think of environments where I've been in where we've had the opportunity to make decisions at the team level. How deep do we go on a particular feature or product backlog item when the framework we're working against is fighting us? Sometimes we have to make some choices to work around that. And if each of these choices requires meetings that get scheduled days or weeks in advance, a committee who's going to decide, evaluating choices ad nauseum, we're not going to have value flowing in the organization. And so that's an example where I think autonomy really helps an organization have value flow quickly. But let's also talk about accountability within Agile projects. Accountability speaks to taking ownership of the work, meeting commitments that get established, and ensuring transparency to the work. Not everything's going to go well. That is just life. That is technology. We're operating in conditions of uncertainty. But we also need to foster an accounting for the progress we make towards those outcomes. When things go wrong, when things go slowly, when things just straight up blow up in your face, we need to create an environment where people can give an accounting for what happened, why did it happen, what measures did we have in place to hopefully have mitigated that situation in the first place, and what was it about those prevention measures, those mitigating circumstances that failed, and then what can we do in the future to make this problem less likely to happen again? We need to have some degree of safety. We want safe fail experiments, and we'll talk about that. And so we have this environment now where we're creating accountability for our teams. We're fostering and accounting for what happened, what choices were made, and why, and that helps the organization learn. So in Agile environments, I think of things like a team's definition of done as one of those accountability artifacts. When we say a feature is done, what does that really mean? What level of code quality do we have? What validation checks are in place? Manual, automated, regression suites. What does it really mean to be done? Because I can remember back when I was writing code going, yeah, it works on my machine was a common trope that we had, back in the late 90s. The works on my machine definition of done is unacceptable. We now have a lot more robust tools and systems and methods for ensuring that when somebody says it's done, that we have an appropriate level of doneness. So if you don't have one, make one. Get together with your team. Say, gosh, it feels like when Dev Specialist 1 says something's done and Dev Specialist 2 says something's done, and then quality specialists look at it, it's not always really done. Drive out that uncertainty and create accountability for adhering to and then improving that definition of done.
Have a topic you want us to tackle? Send an email to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast.
We also have sprint goals. Sprint goals are wonderful ways to create accountability on your sprintly cycle in the Scrum framework. 1, 2, 3, 4 week, 1 month sprints, whatever your cadence, it doesn't matter. You have a goal that keeps everybody focused on that goal and working towards that. Most of the time, you should be achieving your sprint goal. You don't want to be sandbagging to the point where you're not really pushing and focusing on accelerating value, but you also don't want to have sprint goals that are unattainable. So have your sprint goals, take steps towards your product goal. In situations where you may fail to achieve that, use that as a moment to reflect and improve the system as part of one of your retrospectives. And then also leverage metrics for fostering that kind of accountability. Now, I can hear some people going, metrics. Treat metrics as information and not evaluation. So what do I mean by information, not evaluation? These are signals about how the system is performing. It doesn't mean you're a good person or a bad person. It doesn't mean you're a good team or a bad team, because the metrics don't indicate what you're shooting for necessarily. But they are an opportunity for accountability. You can think of things like code coverage quality, regression suite coverage. Not a big fan of velocity because it becomes a target and then it ceases to become a useful measure. So think about what metrics you might have about progressing towards your overall product goal. Gosh, we are 5 sprints through a 10 sprint release target. How are we doing? Are we still halfway through? What adjustments do we want to make? That's what I mean by creating accountability. So if you can't tell, now we're talking about this balance of accountability and autonomy. And so here are a couple thoughts that I have around that. First, if you want accountability and to enable autonomy, we have to be clear with our teams about what the outcomes are that they're striving for. We need clear goals, shared objectives, and a lot of transparency around them. We can't have the guru high on the mountain who is the only one who knows what the outcomes should be. They can't be buried in people's emails, Teams chats, Discords, whatever you might be using, Slack channels. So get clarity on your outcomes, tell people about it, write it down, make it visible, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. And even better, ask other people to repeat it. It's no good if the guru on the mountain is the only one who periodically broadcasts what the objectives are. We need our team members to internalize those objectives and act as if they've been internalized. So now we also need a culture of trust. And I dare say waterfall doesn't work well without some degree of trust, and Agile isn't going to either. So we need trust between our leaders and the teams. One quick way to destroy trust is to hide problems. We're doing creative knowledge work. We're operating in conditions of uncertainty. Things are going to go wrong. Do not hide when things go wrong. I remember as a young project leader, I was on a project in a previous company, several previous companies now that I think about it. That project was financially losing money. We were taking what we would call a markdown. And the partner in charge of that project sat down with me and said, Neumann, how much are we going to lose? And I don't want you to come back and say, next week that the number's bigger. I need the reality check now. And I can tell you which chair I was in when Jeff had that conversation with me, and I very much appreciated that conversation. It was very much a life lesson. It built trust between myself and the partner. And if I had said, oh gosh, we're going to lose $100,000, and the next week come back and say, it's probably more like 2, and then a quarter later come back and say, gosh, it's more like 300, that would have been trust destroying. So build trust through transparency, even when things are going wrong. Use your Agile metrics accordingly. Use these to shine lights on status, not to punish people. Velocity. Use it to inform your forecast. If you have 2,000 points of stuff to do, and you have people who think they're going to get that in, let's pick a number. Let's pick 20 sprints, 100 points per sprint, and your team's demonstrated that they're burning at about 50 points. Now you need to have a conversation. All that stuff we think is going to get done at this future date is quite likely not going to get done. Now what do we want to do about it? What is optional? What are the desirements in that as opposed to the requirements? You can illustrate the progress through burn down charts. You can look at lead times. Lots of good metrics that can be used to inform how we're going forward. We also need to maximize the amount of work not done. One of the Agile Manifesto principles, simplicity. Maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. We have that lever to pull as we're talking about autonomous teams who understand their outcomes. So leaders, let's speak specifically about leadership and what leaders can do to help support autonomy and accountability. One of those things is to really empower your teams and help to remove obstacles, things that are slowing them down, things that are stopping them. Also giving space for innovation. I've seen innovation manifested itself in terms of innovation weeks, innovation days, buffers within sprints, time for design spikes, training resources, time, money, access to tools, conference attendance, coding retreats. Build capacity in your teams so that they have more options to bring to bear when we're asking for autonomous teams. We need regular feedback loops. Support the time for not just the sprint retrospectives baked into the Scrum framework, but also look for ways to do project level retrospectives, dig in on challenges that are cross-team boundaries, do retrospection on that. Really create a chance for the teams to really focus in, try to improve, and you need to balance the micromanagement with the boundaries. So yes, we don't want managers or leaders telling everybody what to do. That's going to destroy autonomy, purpose, and mastery, and it's going to destroy motivation. We want you to focus on what the outcomes are and removing those boundaries. So establish your goals, make clear what constraints are, where can the team make choices, where should the team check with you before pulling the lever, metaphorically. We've made a choice to pull the lever. Can we pull the lever? Give them as much authority as possible so that they can move quickly. Yet, of course, as managers, you still retain certain accountabilities to your leadership. And so it's this delicate balancing act between management and autonomous teams. Foster open communication channels. It's not always a formal meeting. Sometimes it's just checking in with people. We also want to create safe to fail environments, meaning when our teams take risks, if that risk is not able to be addressed, when it bites us, is it something we can recover from? If you can't recover from it, you're not doing it right. So safe fail experiments enable team autonomy. And then fostering continuous learning environments instead of those that punish failure. So a continuous learning environment, when something goes wrong, looks like, oh, that's interesting. We had a safe to fail experiment. It failed. Gosh, that's interesting. What can we learn about it? Now let's go dig in and dive in. So there's no one way to foster autonomy and maintain accountability, but hopefully you now have some different ways to think about what does autonomy look like? What is accountability? How do I balance those things? How do I make sure people know the outcome and we're fostering an environment of trust so that when things go wrong, they can come to me? As a leader, what can I do to create that environment, to remove those obstacles and create space for innovation and at the same time maintain accountability? And I would love to hear from you about how do you feel you are doing in your environment with balancing autonomy and accountability? Is it too much of one, not enough of the other? What might that look like? So feel free to reach out, podcast@agilethought.com. Share with me. And I also have a little favor. If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, please give us a share or a shout out on your favorite social media channel. And you're always welcome to do the good old-fashioned email. Thanks for being a listener to the Agile Coaches Corner podcast. Until next time.
This has been the Agile Coaches Corner podcast, brought to you by Agile Thought. The views, opinions, and information expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and the guests, and do not necessarily represent those of Agile Thought. Get the show notes and other helpful tips from this episode and other episodes at agilethought.com/podcast.